photograph a lot of images in panoramic format, and it got me thinking about, well, why do I do that? And the main reason is I don't want to be tied into the camera's default aspect ratio, which is about 2 to 3 for a 35mm camera, because a lot of compositions don't suit that aspect ratio, particularly panoramas, and I find a lot of landscapes suit panoramas because the natural way of the eye looking at a scene like this is to sweep across the horizon. There are a number of other reasons to shoot panoramas. One is resolution, because when you're stacking images together like that, you're effectively increasing your camera's resolution. Another is it can give me very unusual views that I couldn't get with a standard lens. It also gives me a lot more possibilities, because if I find with the lens I've got I can't quite go wide enough, well, I can easily take a panorama image and then I've got the width I need, or the width I want. Panoramas can also give you unusual views, so I'm going to show an example in bush where I've done a multi-row panorama with a wide angle lens, which gives me effectively a kind of fisheye view. And if you don't have a fisheye, this is one way to get it. So I've got a camera set up here, the very typical scene that I want to make a panorama from. I've got it on a tripod because it's quite dim light and we're on about 1/10 of a second, so I wouldn't be able to handhold this and be confident I'd get sharp images. So this is a very standard setup. The main thing is I've got the camera on a level base. It's got a little bubble level here, which means I can make sure the camera, when I rotate it, doesn't slide off on an angle. I've got a grid screen visible on the back of the camera, and this is so I can make sure I get enough overlap in the images, and I go for about 33% or 1/3. So the grid means that I can start on the left. I do left to right because when the images line up on a computer monitor, they look normal and I can clearly see which images are a panorama. So we take the first image, then I line up something in the grid on one side of the screen and then just move the line of the grid over 1/3, and I carry on around until I've done the complete panorama. You might have noticed I have my camera set on the vertical aspect ratio too, and I often do this because it gives me increased resolution rather than shooting on the horizontal, even though it's a horizontal composition. By shooting on vertical, it actually gives you much larger resolution, and because I specialize in large format mural images, having that extra resolution really makes a difference. There's also a thing in panorama photography where you're supposed to rotate the camera around the nodal point, which is the optical center of the lens. However, when you're shooting landscapes, most landscapes, where the subject's generally distant, it doesn't really make any difference. So I really take out a special panorama head, which allows me to set up the camera so it rotates around the nodal point. I really take one of those out when I'm shooting landscapes. The only reason you would use it is if you're shooting close to your subject, and I'll go through an example of this. It's easier to see by example where I'm shooting in the bush and my subjects are close to the camera lens. I've got an example set up here where you might want to think about rotating the camera around the optical center of the lens, or the nodal point. So I'm fairly close to my subject. I want to take a panorama of this foreground tree, but get a fairly wide view. I've got the camera set up incorrectly in this example, with the camera set up over the back of the tripod, and when I rotate the camera, it's not actually moving around the optical center of the lens, which is somewhere near the front of the lens. You can actually see this effect if I move the camera around. The background is not staying in line with the foreground as the camera rotates around for the panorama, and this causes stitching errors in stitching software. So how do we set this up correctly? So I've got an item of kit here called a nodal slider, which will enable me to move the camera back so that I can line up the optical center of the lens, or the nodal point. So here it is set up. I can move the slider backwards and forwards and just experiment to find the correct optical center of the lens. So I'm going to show you how I would do this if I was hand holding the camera. And what I've done is set the shutter speed to 200th of a second. I've also set the aperture slightly wider to 5.6 to let a bit more light in. And now I just need to adjust the ISO to give me the correct exposure, basically. And the ISO goes to 500 and I've got a good exposure. So hand holding to do the same panorama, I simply hold the camera up, move round to the left side of the panorama, take a note of where the grid is lining up on the right hand vertical on the top, and then move the camera around, lining up that point until I complete the panorama. So in fact, that's probably the most common way I shoot panoramas, because if I'm out and about and the light's bright enough that I don't need to mess around with setting up a tripod, it's quite fast just to take a quick panorama using this method. Just on sunrise, got a nice shot beside the road here.